Thank you to the Foundation of the Wall and Ceiling Industry, and of course the association as well, for inviting me to talk about the economy. I will leave roughly 10 minutes at the end of this session, which is meant to last for about an hour, for questions and answers. So please think about what questions you'd like to ask as I go through the material. My hope, of course, is that I address some of your questions as I go through the material, but in any case, any questions you might have, I welcome them at the end of this broadcast, or toward the end of this broadcast. Let me begin, get into the economic data. Again, thanks to the Association of the Wall and Ceiling Industry for inviting me. My presentation today is entitled Show Me the Money Supply. This is a Tom Cruise themed presentation. You will see that theming throughout the presentation, whether you like it or not. I hope you don't hate it, but it's firmly baked within the cake. Now, why would an economist who is delivering a presentation on a subject as vast as the economy begin by introducing the concept of money supply? Well, as it turns out, it's at the heart of the matter. When money supply is expanding, when the cost of capital is falling, when money becomes more accessible, generally speaking, that's good for economic growth, and it's certainly good for construction activity. However, when money supply is dissipating, when the cost of capital is rising, for instance, in the form of higher interest rates, and when money is more difficult to access, all things being equal, that's bad for economic growth. Much of the data I will show you today are time series data. So the more contemporary data are to the right of the slide. This is money supply graph back to 1959. Again, I'll focus on the right side of the slide for many of these slides or data. You can see here the phenomenal growth in money supply for much of the pandemic recovery period, unprecedented. This is driven by the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States in part, which is expanding its balance sheet past $9 trillion, reducing interest rates as close to zero as was possible, and also the federal government, which is borrowing money aggressively and then spending it in the economy. But a lot of those fiscal stimuli are behind us now, and the Federal Reserve, dealing with inflationary pressures, has now begun to move its policymaking in a different direction. It's been doing that for more than a year now. So you can see money supply is now shrinking. And why do I bring this up? Because when money supply is shrinking, when money supply, or I should say money becomes therefore more difficult to access, and the cost of capital rises because of that policymaking, then that makes it more difficult for economic growth. And that can produce some pretty risky business. So we want to talk about some of the risks inherent in the economy. Now, I must tell you that from the perspective of rejuvenating the economy after the early stage of the pandemic, that in rejuvenating the economy, that policymaking worked pretty well. By the second quarter of 2021, US gross domestic product was above its pre-pandemic level. So the pandemic undoes the economy during the spring of 2020. A bit more than a year later, we're back, at least along that dimension. Unfortunately, that V-shaped, very rapid recovery brings with it an enduring bout of inflation. Let me move off this picture, as it might be awkward for some of you. So inflation, that's the culprit here. Why have we gone from talking about a period of very robust and rapid economic recovery to talking about the possibility of recession at some point in the next few months? Well, again, it's this. In particular, it's the inflation and the Federal Reserve's response to that inflation. So this is your US Consumer Price Index, 12-month percentage change. There are two lines here. The green line, that's your all items consumer price index, overall inflation running at, over the past 12 months, 4.9%. Now, that's certainly better than what it was back in June of 2022. Inflation is running at 9% year over year. But that said, 4.9% is meaningfully above the Federal Reserve's 2% target. Now, for many, many months during the pandemic recovery period, food and energy prices were rising faster than most other prices. That has changed recently. In fact, this morning, oil is back down despite the Saudi Arabians' best efforts to support higher prices. We're seeing the market move in a different direction, a result in part of a growing global economic weakness and therefore shrinking demand for oil. But food and energy prices for many months were rising faster. And so if you look at the gold color line there, that's your core consumer price index, all items less food and energy. But because food and energy prices have been falling more recently, if you strip those prices out, that measure of inflation in gold actually is now higher than the overall measure of inflation, the core rate at 5.5% year over year. Egg prices, for instance, have been falling since December. I don't know how many of you have become engrossed in a conversation about egg prices this year, maybe with a neighbor. And once you get involved in those conversations, it's almost impossible to extract oneself, as it turns out. I delivered a presentation very early in the year at the University of Delaware. You may or may not know this, but the University of Delaware gave us the greatest quarterback in NFL history, Joe Flacco. But also their team name is the Blue Hens. And I looked those Blue Hens right in the face and I said, you Blue Hens should be raising chickens because egg prices were high. And they also did not laugh at that. But the point is that food and energy prices have been falling more recently. And so this is what you see with respect to the inflation. But again, either way you slice it, inflation is above that Federal Reserve's 2% target. And we economists have a tendency when we talk about inflation to talk about it in the context of interest rates and Federal Reserve policymaking. But there's another effect here, isn't there? This increases the cost on households and also has effect on businesses as well. And it's a cumulative effect because consumers are now being walloped by these high prices month after month after month. So if you were to compare prices in May of 2020, why that month? That's the first month of the economic recovery from the pandemic. So we lost those 22 million jobs in March and April of 2020. We start adding jobs back in May of 2020. So if you compare what prices looked like back then to April of 2023, which is last month for which we have these data, you look at the headline numbers at the bottom of the slide, overall inflation running at 18.3% in less than 3 years in a country that aspires to 2% inflation per annum. Core inflation running at 15.3%. Look at some of these categories here in green. Energy price up 55%. Used car and truck price up 39% in less than 3 years. Transportation services, that includes things like your airfares, up 27%. Tobacco and smoking product price up 22%. New vehicle price up 22%. So one of the worst things you can do is smoke in a new car because that's bad for your health, destroys the new car smell, but also renders one susceptible to some of these vast inflationary pressures. Now, again, inflation has dissipated over the past year. So if I were going to show you the consumer price index data for April of 2022 versus April of 2023, you've seen the headline numbers down below already, the 4.9% overall rate inflation, 5.5% on the core. But again, you still have these chunky rates of inflation here in some of these categories. Transportation services, again, things like airfares up 11%, shelter and food up roughly 8%. And who does this affect the most, by the way? These high prices for housing and food, disproportionately the people at the lowest quintiles of income. They're the ones for whom shelter and food comprises a disproportionate share of their budget. They're getting hammered by these high prices. And that's one of the reasons the economy is at risk. Now, the other aspect of this, of course, is that there is a Federal Reserve element to this. The Federal Reserve is now trying to combat this excess inflation in the economy. And how do they do that? They do that by turning to their principal policy-making instrument, the federal funds rate. That's the overnight bank lending rate. It's a rate at which banks can borrow from one another overnight to shore up their reserves. And why would a bank do that, shore up its reserves? Because you need a certain amount of reserves in the bank to make loans outside of the bank. Here I'm graphing through the upper limit of the Fed funds target range. As it turns out, for 2 years, we were at the minimum possible, 0.25%. When inflation began to blossom during the spring of 2021, the Federal Reserve responded by doing precisely nothing about it. They deemed it to be transitory. A synonym for transitory is fleeting. It was largely, they thought, supply chain driven. So the notion was, hey, demand is roaring back as we're becoming vaccinated, as the economies are reopening in fits and starts. Supply chains had been shuttered to varying degrees and were having a difficult time reopening. And so supply fell short of demand. That's inflationary. But as supply chains healed, as the Port of Los Angeles or other ports normalized in terms of their activity, supply would rise up to meet demand, and that excess inflation would go away. It would get back to 2% inflation. Instead, what the Federal Reserve did was they waited too long, and they presided over the creation of a wage price spiral. So in the spring of 2021, prices take off. Employees say to their bosses, hey, look, boss, look at the CPI data, the consumer price index data. I look at them all the time. They never had before, by the way, but I look at them all the time. I need a raise because these prices are going haywire. Boss says, no problem. Here's your raise, because I'll just pass along my cost increases to my customers because I can do that in an inflationary environment. In fact, inflation and corporate profitability are positively correlated. But of course, that engenders another a bout of inflation. Workers come back and say, I need even more, boss. Boss says, here you go. But now we're in this wage price spiral. So coming into the pandemic, the upper limit of the Fed funds range, a target range, was above zero, meaningfully above zero. The Federal Reserve comes to the rescue with the federal government and reduces that interest rate as close to zero as is possible. 0.25% is the minimum possible here. It lasts for 2 years. Again, they don't do anything in 2021. They don't start raising rates until March 16th of 2022. And then they keep raising them. For 0.25% on March 16th of 2022, then 0.5%. Then 4 meetings, 0.75% each meeting. Then back to 0.5%, then 0.25%, then 0.25%. May 3rd, meaning May 3rd of last month, 0.25%, which is how you get to a Fed funds target range that used to be 0.5% upper limit, is now 5.25%. Now, ostensibly, the Federal Reserve is not trying to destroy the economy. They're trying to engineer a soft landing. What does that mean? They want to slow the economy down by reducing borrowing and spending, borrowing and investing, bring demand into conformity with supply, thereby wringing excess inflation out of the economy. But at this point, is it possible for them to engineer a soft landing, or is it mission impossible? That's the question. Now, here's the good news. For right now, the economy is not in recession. Now, here's how the Federal Reserve confuses these issues. So this first quote comes from our Federal Reserve Chairman, Jerome Powell, back in August of 2022. He says, quote, while higher interest rates, slower growth, and softer labor market conditions will bring down inflation, they'll also bring some pain to households and businesses. These are the unfortunate costs of reducing inflation, but a failure to restore price stability would mean far greater pain. In other words, since they've started fighting inflation, they've been very serious about trying to get back to that 2% inflation mandate of theirs. I mean, remember, it's not a choice, it's a mandate. 2% inflation is our nation's, right now, definition of price stability. In November of 2022, the Federal Reserve Chairman says this, quote, let me say this, it is very premature to be thinking about pausing, meaning pausing our rate hikes. So people, when they hear lags, they think about a pause. What's that about? What's this presentation about? Lag effects. So when the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, let's say on March 16th of 2022 or May 3rd of 2023, the complete effect of that on the economy does not manifest itself immediately. It takes some time, maybe as much as 18 to 24 months for that interest rate to have its complete effect on the economy, which means that even the March 16th, 2022 increase in interest rates has yet to have its full effect, let alone all the subsequent 9 rate hikes at 9 meetings. So, so many people, investors, will say, look, Federal Reserve, you've done enough. Wait for these lag effects to wash through the economy, slow the economy down. You don't need to over tighten. You don't need to drive us unnecessarily into a recession. But the rejoinder from the Federal Reserve Chairman is in this third sentence, it's very premature. So in the span of 3 sentences, our Federal Reserve Chairman says the words very premature twice. Not especially eloquent, clearly not written by ChatGPT, but it makes the point nonetheless. It's very premature, in my view, to think about or to be talking about pausing our rate hike. Now, that was said 7 months ago, admittedly. And there are some people who will tell you they have now paused. In fact, expectation from the market is they will not raise rates at their June 13th, June 14th meeting. But they also tell us they're data-driven, right? They're data-dependent. And the data still suggests there's plentiful economic momentum out there, enough to support inflation still meaningfully above their 2% target. For instance, gross domestic product, the broadest measure of U.S. economic progress, quarterly data, annualized rates of growth. If you look toward the left of the slide, you can see the undoing of the economy during the first half of 2020, including the negative 29.9% performance through the second quarter of 2020 on an annualized basis. But then the V-shaped recovery, 35.3% during the third quarter. Several ensuing quarters of high single-digit rates of growth in an economy accustomed to growing 1.5% to 3% per annum. True. During the first half of 2022, America sustains a setback. Negative real GDP growth for 2 consecutive quarters, satisfying a technical definition of recession. The economy grew in nominal terms, but once you adjust for inflation, it was negative. But then the third quarter of 2022 bounced back, 3.2%, and 2.6% to close out the year. During the first quarter of 2023, the U.S. economy grows 1.3%, which sounds pretty soft and was, but it's misleading. A lot of that was due to inventory decumulation, which drives down GDP growth estimates. The consumer actually spent handsomely during the first quarter of the year, with spending growing 3.8% on an annualized basis. The Atlanta Federal Reserve has a product known as GDP Now, which estimates the current quarter gross domestic product. The current quarter, of course, is the second quarter of 2023, and the estimate right now is standing at 2.0%. None of these are indicia of recession, and moreover, there are parts of the economy that remain especially strong. I'll give you an example. The consumer, this is US retail sales, monthly data. The consumer has stared inflation right in the eyes and spent right through it. And I'll give you an example. This is retail sales, but the same is true with respect to services like air travel. I don't know if you've seen recently, but ticket prices have been skyrocketing. During a recent 12-month period, airfares are up 17.7%. Now, look, I know you're very successful people. Many of you are business owners at the top of your professions. I get that. Very generous with your money, all of those things. And so when you board an airplane, my guess is, I don't know all of you, of course. I know some of you, but not all of you. My guess is that you are aisle and window people. That's who you are. Because you're successful people. You're aisle and window people. Okay, there's no shame in that. And when you get into your aisle or window seat, at that moment in economic history, there's only one thing you're hoping or praying for, and it is not the safety of the flight. That's incidental and presumed. No, the one thing you want out of that moment in economic history is an empty middle seat. That's all you care about, and that does not make you a bad person. It does not make you a good person, but does not make you a bad person. But much to our chagrin, because I'm an aisle person myself, the middle seat has been full. And that's because Americans have just looked at inflation and spent right through it. Now, it is true, however, that retail sales dipped in November to December of last year. So retailers came into 2023 with plentiful inventory. They discounted that merchandise aggressively in January. Sales took off. But then again, retail sales slipped a bit in February and March. So there is some incipient weakness. Things have flattened out on the retail sales front. Nonetheless, the consumer is concerned about recession. They've taken out a lot of debt. Some have to start repaying their student debt in September, maybe more on that later. But they continue to be supported by an extremely strong labor market. And I suspect that for many of you, your principal challenge continues to be hiring and retaining qualified personnel. This net change in US jobs, monthly data. You can see the last reading here is for May of 2023, a month during which America adds 339,000 jobs. The last time we lost jobs was in December of 2020, which was a COVID-intensive pre-vaccination month. We've added millions and millions of jobs since. Unemployment is down to 3.7% nationally, about where it was pre-pandemic. And as many people as American employers have hired, they would like to hire even more. According to the most recent JOLTS, the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, America as of April home to 10.1 million available unfilled jobs. This is a country with 1.7 job openings for every unemployed American, nearly 400,000 unfilled jobs in construction. And that's inflationary. When you've got 3.7% unemployment and this many job openings, more than 10 million, that's going to keep upward pressure on wages, obviously. And the problem is that the size of the workforce has not kept up with the needs, demands, wishes, aspirations of the economy. We're not growing the workforce enough. Labor force participation is meaningfully below what it was pre-pandemic, for instance, in part because many baby boomers retired during the pandemic earlier than anticipated. So, and the real problem here, as it turns out, just between you and me, the real problem is men. Now, some of the women in the audience might say, well, that's a general proposition, sir. I'm only talking about the labor force dynamics. I'm not talking about household chores or anything else. So if you were to compare the labor force participation rate in 1980, when music was good, versus 2023, so that was Rush, Styx, Billy Squier, Prince, whose first hit was in 1978. So labor force participation rate tells you the proportion of people who are eligible to work who are either working or looking for work. So I'm taking a delta of two different proportions, one in 1980, one in 2023. So if you look at the tabular data here, the first row at the top, which is the bolded row. So in America, you have to be at least 16 years of age to be part of the labor force. In Canada, it's 15. So between 1980 and 2023, the overall labor force fell 1.2 percentage points, falling 9.4 percentage points for men, while rising 5.7 percentage points for women. So men jumped out of the labor market, either working or looking for work. Women jumped in. I can break this down by age: 16 to 19-year-olds, negative 19.5% overall, negative 23% for men, negative 16% for women. What's that about? That's college. So the notion among many families has been, got to have your kids go to college, so on and so forth. as pathways to prosperity. And so if one is in college, one is less likely to offer their services to the labor market. 20-24-year-olds, negative 5.6 percentage points overall, negative 13 percentage points for men, but positive 1.3 percentage points for women. What's that about? Well, it could still be college, because it probably takes most guys 6 to 8 years to finish college. But then 25-34-year-olds, positive 3.6 percentage points overall, negative 6 percentage points for men, positive 13 percentage points for women. What's that about? What are these young men doing? They're 25 to 34 years of age. They're neither working nor looking for work. What are they doing? No one really knows because everyone's too scared to ask. But the point is, nothing good, probably. My guess is it involves a couch in a parent's basement somewhere with bologna and salami sandwiches mysteriously appearing from above. Maybe some video games, maybe some weed. I'm not judging. I'm just telling you what the data suggests. Now, you might say, Aniba, take a step back. The AWCI did not invite you to be emotional. You're an economist. You're supposed to be dispassionate and objective, data-driven. You're getting angry out there in computer land. You might say to me, Aniba, the idea of a 33-year-old American man, playing video games all day in lieu of work and maybe smoking some weed, that's adorable. I don't disagree. I think that is adorable, but less adorable when they're 43. So you look at 35 to 44-year-olds, positive 3.7 percentage points overall, negative 5 percentage points for men, positive 11.8 percentage points for women. Now, construction, as it turns out, for better or for worse, is a male-dominated industry. More than 80% of construction workers are male. So this is one of the reasons, this sort of idleness among many young American men, that the industry has so much difficulty recruiting. There are other factors as well, immigration policy and sort of cultural dynamics as well. But all of this pushes prices higher, including the cost of delivering construction services. And American employers collectively would like to hire more workers, despite the fact that we're already at record levels of employment. If you were to compare February of 2020 employment, why that month, that's the last month before we shut down the economy, versus May of 2023, the last month for which you have data, over those 3 years and 3 months, America added 3.7 million jobs. These horizontal green bars tell you how many jobs are added or subtracted by each of these categories. So construction, the segment which we have most interest today, up 320,000 jobs. So lots of hiring in construction. But a lot of the hiring has been among unskilled laborers, while a lot of the departures from the industry have been among those more skilled professionals, including those retiring baby boomers. At the top of the list is professional business services. That's your accounting firms, your law firms. Lots of white-collar jobs are in those categories. It's a very large part of the economy, which helps explain part of its primacy here, but it also disproportionately offers the opportunity for people to work remotely, and that's what many people want. A recent survey indicates that 68% of Americans prefer to work remotely. They don't want to go into the office. They don't want to commute. They don't want to be with their colleagues. They do not like their colleagues. A separate survey finds that 57% of Americans find their colleagues to be annoying because they overshare, meaning I asked you what you did this weekend. I did not intend for you to answer. They take credit for one another's work, but the number one reason people find the colleagues to be annoying, they interrupt during meetings, which can happen on Zoom and go to webinar and typically does. Nonetheless, there is this general preference for remote work. At the bottom of the list, leisure and hospitality. That's your hotel and restaurant worker. Many hotels and restaurants would love to hire more staff, but this is the lowest wage segment of the economy, so often outcompeted for human capital along the dimension of compensation, and also as a general proposition, they do not offer the opportunity for people to work remotely. And this is one of construction's challenges as well, of course, because most construction, of course, continues to be delivered in person at a job site. Now, this issue of labor force availability is even more acute in regions of the country that have been growing the fastest. This is employment growth in the 25 largest metropolitan areas, percentage growth in jobs between February of 2020 and April of 2023. We do not yet have the May data at the subnational level. So a 3-year and 2-month comparison here, what do you see the dominance here in terms of job growth? The American South. Dallas, Tampa, San Antonio, Orlando, Charlotte, Phoenix, Atlanta, Riverside, California, Houston, Miami, San Diego, the South. That's where the population growth has been. That's where the job growth has been. That's where the demand for construction is potentially growing the fastest. Now you can see Philadelphia slipping into that left-hand column, but for the most part, the Northeast, including my town of Baltimore, are in the right-hand column: Baltimore, New York, Boston, Washington, D.C. You can also see the Midwest there in the right-hand column, the slower growing markets. That's not where the job growth has been, because that's not where the population growth has been. There's an equilibrium there, dynamic. In any case, St. Louis, Chicago, Minneapolis, Detroit in that right-hand column. Now, I find this slide to be interesting. revealing to a certain extent. But the next slide is far more important macroeconomically. Same 25 major metropolitan areas, but instead of employment growth, these are unemployment rates as of April of 2023. And here's the problem. These unemployment rates are too low. They say, Anirban, that's crazy talk, sir. Not only are you emotional, you're a crazy person. We love low rates of unemployment, Anirban. We view that as a sign of national economic strength, economic vitality. I agree. As a general proposition, we like low rates of unemployment, but less so when you've got 10.1 million available unfilled jobs in this country, nearly 400,000 of them in construction, and the Federal Reserve is still seeing inflation across the countryside. Because the Federal Reserve looks at these data and says, I cannot live with this equilibrium. I cannot have regions like Baltimore, where the labor force has shrunk at 1.9% unemployment, Detroit 2.0%. You know, the highest unemployment rates are in the low fours. That's low. And what that triggers is between 4 and 5% wage growth, because people are still looking to hire workers and they have to compete for those workers. But to get to 2% inflation, you probably can afford wage growth of between 3 and 3.5%. And so when the Federal Reserve Chairman said in August of 2022, I'm going to cause some pain to households, that's what he's talking about. I cannot live with this equilibrium. Somebody is going to have to lose their job. It's nothing personal. I don't know who it's going to be, but someone's going to have to lose their job because I cannot stand by and watch all this inflation. I've got a 2% inflation mandate. So we've got already high interest rates, and the Federal Reserve is still waging that war on inflation. And what does that mean? That means the risk of recession is high. Again, 1996, Jerry Maguire, I cried. I cried a lot. I'm emotional after all. You can tell that from this webinar. I'm excessively emotional for an economist. There's no question about that. In any case, again, we're not in recession now, but there are some indications of expanding economic weakness. So I'll give you an example. For much of this pandemic recovery period, the mantra among many CEOs has been, let me chase demand. All right, I got a lot of rapidly growing economy out there. There's lots of unmet demand. If I can get to market first, if I hire the workers, lease the equipment, take on the warehouse space, so on and so forth, so that I can expand my capacity and then serve that unmet demand, I win that market share. And I can monetize that market share in an inflation-oriented economy or inflationary economy. Because again, corporate profits are positively correlated with inflation. I can support bigger profit margins. But now more CEOs seem to be suggesting, maybe I've taken out too much cost here. Maybe I've made some bad hires. Maybe I don't need such a large HR department, et cetera, et cetera. So for instance, let me first, before I talk about the likelihood of recession, define it for you. I had mentioned that early in 2022, the first half of 2022, America sustained 2 consecutive quarters of negative real GDP growth, satisfying a technical definition of recession, but not the definition of recession. This is the definition. The National Bureau of Economic Research's Business Cycle Dating Committee is the official recession scorekeeper. They're the ones, accordingly, that maintain a chronology of U.S. business cycles. So they're the ones who told us in 2002 that the recession of 2001 began in March of 2001 and ended in November of 2001. Their traditional definition of recession is, quote, a significant decline in economic activity that spread across the economy and that lasts more than a few months, except the recession that declared in 2020 begins in February of 2020, ends in April of 2020, arguably not more than a few months. They declared it a recession unless, why? Because they can. They are the definition. They sit in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and what's more, there is no fixed rule about which indicators contribute information to NBR's process, or how they're weighted in the determination of recession. They can look at it whatever they please. Now, as a practical matter, they look at things like retail sales, industrial production, job growth, unemployment, gross domestic product, of course. But they can look at whatever they please. And because the government's statistics are published at various lags, the NBR committee cannot officially designate a recession until after it starts, and often not until it's over. So, for instance, we knew we were in recession in March of 2020. We shut down the economy. It was open in February, closed in March. Recession had begun. We knew that, but the NBER's committee could not declare a recession until the confirming data arrived, and that would happen a couple of months later. So in any case, that's definition. And again, we're not in recession now, but there are indications. So for instance, this comes on the gross domestic product data. This is non-residential fixed investment in equipment. Now, during the earlier stages of the pandemic recovery period, equipment purchases were rising, but the last 2 quarters, they have been falling. Now, some of you might say, Anirban, that could still be supply chain issues. So I spoke recently to a group of mechanical contractors out of Washington, D.C., and they said to me that their lead time for switchgear was something in the nature of 50, 60, 70 weeks, that their lead time for generators was something akin to that. One gentleman told me his lead time for switchgear was almost 2 years. So there's that, but I don't think this is driven by supply chain issues. This is driven, I think, by business operators saying, you know what, I've taken a lot of cost. Maybe I need to dial down some of this cost accumulation. And you can see this in the survey data. According to a November 2022 PwC survey of US executives, 26% of firms are planning to reduce the number of full-time employees over the next 12 to 18 months. So that's 1/4 of businesses saying, you know, we're going to shift away from having so many full-time employees. In August of 2022, so this is a year ago roughly, 50% of firms that they already had or had a plan in place to reduce overall headcount. They're thinking about it. Now you look at the employment data, clearly lots of folks are still taking on workers, but the attitude has changed. 4 out of 5 executives surveyed by PwC in November of 2022 said a recession is coming in the next 6 months. They were wrong about that. That was 7 months ago. Recession's not here yet. But the attitude has changed. People are looking for cost savings. They've announced layoffs in many cases. Here's some layoffs announced over the past couple of years. The one at the top is Amazon. So that's CEO Andy Jassy. Andy Jassy's announced 2 layoffs this year, totaling 27,000, the most recent one being 9,000 jobs. But here's another thing that he did. Andy Jassy said to his white-collar workers, you have to come into the office 3 days a week. That's right. You have to come into the office 3 days in 1 week. Are we barbarians? Is this the 19th century? Is this how we treat people, treat workers? Now, my guess is that was done to foment collaboration, innovation, supervision, but also try to get some people to quit. And some people have quit because of that policymaking. And Meta, the CEO there, of course, is Mark Zuckerberg. Now, he has declared this the year of efficiency at Meta. During a recent earnings call, he said the words efficient or efficiency 41 times. He's announced a major layoff, and his stock price is way up this year, until a few days ago, about 100% for the year. So he's delighting shareholders. He's delighting the board by cutting costs. And many CEOs are not that creative. They play follow the leader. So when they see Mark Zuckerberg driving up his share price by cutting costs, then many CEOs, and you can see many CEOs have announced major layoffs over the course of the last couple of years. Now, what's the issue here again? It's the high cost of capital. It's not just that, by the way. It's also the availability of credit. So we had Silicon Valley Bank fail on March 10th of this year. We had Signature Bank fail on March 12th of this year. That was the 16th and 19th largest banks in America, respectively. Then the 14th largest bank in the country got in trouble. That was First Republic, eventually taken out by JP Morgan. Then we've had issues of, Western Alliance and Pac West and so on and so forth. So, and so credit is tightening because the regulators are coming in. Bankers are scared about making bad loans, though bad loans were not why Silicon Valley Bank failed, by the way, but nonetheless, they're concerned. And so higher interest rates and maybe some tightening credit conditions, and that's what tend to impact industries like real estate and construction. Let's talk about that now. And I want to start this part of the story residentially and then move to commercial or non-residential construction data. I began this presentation talking about interest rates. I think it's the right place to begin, particularly for this audience. You happen to be in an especially interest rate sensitive segment, lots of developer-driven activities, and of course, developers are susceptible to higher costs of capital. If you're in the single-family market or multifamily market, developers are still impacted one way or the other. Builders are impacted, and of course, home purchasers are impacted. So let me continue on with this interest rate related story by showing you 2 interest rates of interest, the 30-year fixed mortgage rate in gold and the 15-year fixed mortgage rate in green. Green and gold, of course, the color of money, which was a 1986 Tom Cruise film, also starring Paul Newman playing the part of Fast Eddie Felsen. Now, back in January of 2022, the 30-year fixed mortgage rate is standing at 3.22%. The most recent week for data from Freddie Mac, 6.79%. Now, some of you might say, Anirban, 6.79% on a 30-year fixed is not a big deal. My first mortgage rate was 18%. My first mortgage rate was 15%. I've had people come up to me after presentations bragging about the fact that they used to pay 50% interest. I'm not impressed. But it is an interesting history, and for those folks, 6.79 would not appear especially onerous. However, for millennials and Generation Z, these interest rates are preposterously high, and that's really who subtracted themselves from the prospective home purchasing marketplace. It's that would-be first-time buyer. frustrated by high prices, frustrated by a lack of inventory, and now quite high mortgage rates by their standards. Now, as I move toward the tail end of this presentation, I want to show you a number of leading economic indicators because I want to pivot from a discussion of what's been going on to a discussion of what's likely to happen during the year ahead. Now, the home purchasing process often begins with a mortgage application. So unless you're a private equity firm or a quite well-heeled American household, typically people have to borrow money to purchase a property like that. So this is your U.S. Mortgage Loan Applications Composite Index from the Mortgage Bankers Association, and this index is down 80% since this 2021 peak. And again, who subtracted themselves from the market? It's that first-time buyer or that first-time move-up buyer, but that younger buyer in general who is more interest rate sensitive. Now, we've seen the marketplace adjusting to this. So this is the S&P Case-Shiller U.S. National Home Price Index. Obviously, you saw a very large rise in home prices for a very lengthy period of time during the pandemic recovery period. Then recently, a dip in home prices. And then here's the thing, and this has surprised me. And I must admit to you, and I'm going to deliver to you my forecast for the economy late in this presentation, in about 15 minutes. But in many ways, the economy has not worked out the way I had expected. And this is one of them. So I thought the price were going to continue to slide because interest rates have risen so rapidly and are so elevated compared to where they were. But you can see that during the most recent period for which we have data, home prices have been stabilized. That in some markets, home prices have been rising throughout this cycle. So here is the S&P Case-Shiller Home Price Index by Metropolitan Area. This is 12-month percentage change through March of 2023. Now, when did the Federal Reserve begin raising rates? March of 2022. So this is that year, March of 2022 versus March of 2023. Yes, you see some price adjustments in technology-intensive markets like Seattle, San Francisco, San Diego. That's true. But if you look, Miami, Tampa, Charlotte, Atlanta, again, the South, that's where the domination has been in terms of economic growth. It's been the American South. Charlotte is a fabulous market, as an example. You would not know from that interest rates have risen. Now, this is a 12-month percentage change. The next slide is going to be the 1-month percentage change in home prices. This is shocking to me. So the 0% axis is the left-hand axis. Everything is gaining in terms of home prices. Now, look, what's going on here? The first-time buyer is sort of out of the market. Who's in the market, therefore? People who already have been owning homes, who have equity in homes, who have a fair amount of money, probably. They are competing for scant inventory, so not a lot of homes for sale. A lot of these homes are expensive, by the way. And so that's bidding up this statistic. But nonetheless, whether it's San Francisco or Detroit or Tampa or Dallas, home prices rose in March of 2023, suggests the market is already stabilizing. And you can also see this in the form of, most importantly for this audience, construction activity. So here's another leading indicator. This is U.S. residential building permits. That's a leading indicator, of course, because if you're a builder, you've got to pull a permit before you build. The yellow line there is single family. And yeah, that tumbled, single family building permits, but it's starting to bounce back. Why? Because the inventory is so low, and because there's so many cash buyers out there, people who are simply not that sensitive to interest rates. They take a 3-year adjustable rate mortgage and they'll refinance later, whatever it is, that market's starting to come back. The green line there is multifamily. And I thought that would hang in a bit better than it has. But what's happening here? There's lots of demand for apartments. We have a structural housing shortage in America. But credit is tightening for real estate developers. So again, the developer-driven activity is making it more difficult to line up financing. The developers are having to put in more equity into the deal. It's sometimes difficult for them to line up that equity. And so you can see multifamily permits actually have been shrinking a bit recently. That's not because there's a lack of demand for apartments. That's because there's a more difficult developer-driven environment right now because of that higher cost of capital and also because of the tightening credit conditions, thanks to the likes of Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and other bankers being nervous about finding their way into error. So let me talk about another leading indicator now. This is the Architecture Billings Index. It's a leading indicator because if architects are busy upstream, contractors are more likely to be busy downstream. So you see the 50-yard line where Wes has crossed that slide. Any reading above 50 means that architects are collectively busier now than they were last month. And for much of the pandemic recovery period, architects were getting busier and busier and busier. Well, of course they were. The economy was coming back very quickly. Moreover, people were looking for income, and they could not get that income from the bond portion of their portfolio. Interest rates were low. Now, last year, fixed income got its last name back, but prior to that, people are looking for income, and real estate generates income. It's rents, it's hotel daily room charges, whatever it happens to be, it generates income. And when people invest in real estate, that often triggers construction activity, and before that, design activity, as properties are repositioned in the marketplace or built from scratch. But for 6 of the last 7 months here, architects have been getting less busy. That's at higher cost of capital. That's the impact, for instance, of these weaker banks that are out there, and the concerns among community banks and regional banks that they don't want to be so exposed to commercial real estate. Now, here's the good news. I can tell this association and its members anything it wants to hear. You want me to tell you the economy is great and go on CNN and do that? I can do that. You want me to tell you the economy is terrible and go on Fox News and do that? I can do that. Because I've got enough data to tell any story that I would like. And in fact, I'm telling 2 separate stories with 1 data series on this chart. This is total non-residential construction spending. You see the line at the top there that ends at the top, the lighter green colored line? That's total non-residential construction spending. You say, Anirban, my goodness, fabulous. What a rapid recovery from the worst of the pandemic. Terrific. Yeah, it's terrific, except that that does not control for inflation. If I control for inflation, you get the line in darker green. Incomplete recovery. So, Anirban, what's going on here? Because we as an industry have hired 320,000 people, that's residential and non-residential. Well, we've hired a ton of workers. Why are we not producing more on an inflation-adjusted basis? Because productivity has fallen in many cases. Why? Because the best workers, the baby boomers, have left in large numbers, replaced often by those unskilled laborers. And so that's where we are. And it's still a very much constrained construction environment, and that helps to drive up costs. Of course, that's inflationary. You can break this down by segments. So this is non-residential construction spending by subsector. February of 2020, again, the month before we shut down the economy, versus April of 2023, the last month which we have these data. At the bottom, you see segments like lodging. That's your hotel room construction. Business travel just not come back aggressively. Office is also the negative. This is not just for inflation. So in real terms, it's much worse than that. Now, data center construction is in the office category. And that, of course, has been fast, furious, and frenetic. But the traditional office-based construction, that's where the weakness has been, for obvious reasons. We've got high national office vacancy. Now, at the top of the list is manufacturing. Industrial policy is back in America. The government is again saying, we want certain industries to be here. It starts off with the Trump administration with the emphasis on steel and aluminum production, and it certainly has continued into the Biden administration with the emphasis on production of inputs to alternative energy, electric vehicles, batteries, and of course, computer chips. And so, billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars of manufacturing plants are presently under construction right now. About $200 billion just in computer chip manufacturing. That's Columbus, Ohio, Syracuse, New York, Chandler, Arizona, Sherman, Texas, Boise, Idaho, so on and so forth. So that manufacturing sector is on fire and will continue to be as America continues to promote industrial policy to try to bring more supply chain back stateside. So, different segments performing differently. One final thing to point out, inflation, of course, and its impact on construction. We could talk about wage inflation. Wages have been rising at the fastest pace in about 4 decades in construction. But this is the inputs to construction producer price index. So this is wholesale inflation. And what you see here is that as of April of 2023, on a 12-month basis, construction materials prices down 1.1%. So we were going at 20-25% in terms of materials prices. Prices started to come down. Not all prices, not all prices. So if you look at certain materials prices here, this 12% has changed. So you can see a lot of the decline in prices has been in categories that just surged during the early stages of the pandemic or during and after the beginning of the onset of hostilities in Ukraine. So you can see natural gas prices are down, crude energy material prices are down, along with softwood lumber. And that, of course, softwood lumber prices took off during the earlier phases of the pandemic recovery period. Now, concrete, and many of you are interested in that price, up 13%. So concrete has been an exception. Shortage of cement globally. There have been some other factors at work there, but you still see in some of these categories some pretty chunky rates of inflation. And this, as America seeks to rebuild its infrastructure. If you look at the category that includes gypsum products, non-metallic mineral products like gypsum, those prices are up 44% since February of 2020, 10% year over year. Though you're starting to see, you can see some downward adjustment in this input, which is what you would expect to see as supply chains come back to something approaching normal. However, when you look at insulation materials, something very different here. This price is up 37% since February of 2020, 8% year over year. But look at the trajectory here. You still see plentiful upward momentum, at least until recently, in insulation materials prices. And again, lots of factors at work there. So it depends on who you are, the kinds of projects you work on to determine how much inflation you're seeing in your materials prices. If you're energy intensive, natural gas, for instance, natural gas prices continue to be under downward pressure, then that's a different story. If it's about insulation, if it's about concrete, then of course still plentiful inflation embedded within the supply chain. Okay, enough of that. Let's turn to the forecast now, and then we can go to Q&A. So this is a 2014 Tom Cruise film. Not my favorite Tom Cruise film in the interest of full disclosure, but an amazing transition slide as we go to the forecast. Now, let me show you some leading indicators again. This is the Conference Board's US Leading Economic Index. This is a composite of 10 leading indicators in their own right, all baked into one composite measure, which I'm graphing for you here. This is an index that predicted the 2001 recession, predicted 07, 08, 09, and is now saying tougher economic times are ahead. There are certain segments of the economy that are already in recession, including the nation's manufacturing sector. So this is business inventories. You see the green slice in the middle, that's your retail inventories. So I mentioned that retailers have been having to discount pretty aggressively to sell merchandise, to move merchandise. You can see the sort of negative reports coming out of Home Depot, Target, and Macy's. That's sort of that middle market discretionary spending category. And retailers do not like to discount, and they don't like weakness. So when they see weakness and discounting, they order less from the merchant wholesalers. That's in the orange up top, or the burnt umber. And that's your middlemen and middlewomen, your distributors. Their inventories have been rising. When they see their inventories rising, they order less from the manufacturers in the light blue down below. And manufacturers are seeing that their orders are down, and therefore production follows suit. So these measures, at least collectively, suggest that recession is coming. This one screams it. This is your yield curve. The gold line there is your yield on the 1-year treasury. The green line is yield on the 10-year treasury. So typically you'd expect the interest rate on a 10-year instrument to be meaningfully above that on a 1-year. So when I buy a US treasury, I'm lending to the federal government for 10 years, and therefore I'm not going to see my principal for a decade. And I'm going to demand more interest in the interim to reward me for my patience. Conversely, if I buy a 1-year treasury, I only have to wait 12 months to get my principal back, risk-free basically, now that we're through the debt ceiling crisis. But occasionally the bond market goes upside down, topsy-turvy, inside out, Diana Ross, whatever. The point is, sometimes you get inversion, and the gold line goes above the green line. Now, the gray shade areas here are periods of recession dating back several decades. So when do you see the gold line go above the green line, this yield curve inversion? Just before the 1970 recession, before 73, 74, 75, before 1980, before 81, 82, before the 1990, 1991 recession, before the 2001 recession, before 07, 08, 09, not so much before 2020, that was caused by something else, but now we have massive inversion. The yield on the 1-year today is 5.18%. The yield on the 10-year is in the range of 3.71%. I was speaking to you right now. Massive inversion. And this has been a almost flawless predictor of recession for decades. And so I think recession is coming, and maybe you can't handle the truth. They might point out to me, this is not the truth, Anibal, this is your forecast, which may prove to be false. Fair enough. And moreover, you might point out to me, that wasn't said by Tom Cruise, Anibal, in 1992, A Few Good Men. That was said by Jack Nicholson. Fair enough. Jack Nicholson playing the part of Colonel Nathan Jessup. Colonel Nathan Jessup is on the stand, being grilled by a young military attorney, Lieutenant Daniel Caffey, asking a series of questions that eventually elicits this response, which is an admission of guilt. And that young military attorney, Lieutenant Daniel Caffey, is played by one young and quite handsome Tom Cruise. I think the economy gets worse before it gets better. Though you might see a bit of a bounce back in second quarter gross domestic product. Inventory fell during the first quarter. You might see a bit more buildup in inventory because we're approaching the summer months here, summer spending season. And that'll drive up gross domestic product, perhaps. But then I think you'll see some real weakness in the economy for the third and fourth quarters. I would say to the economy falls to recession on September 5th. So Aniban, hold up. At no point during this webinar have you demonstrated enough insight to allow yourself to predict with that level of specificity. I don't disagree. Why did I say September 5th? That's the day after Labor Day. I think you'll see consumers spending and traveling this summer, but then they look at their credit card bills. Then they have to start paying back their student loans. Then the labor market, I think, gets a bit weaker as we start seeing more layoff activity. The impact of these lag effects because of previous rate increases, the impact of a tightening credit cycle. You know, you've got $1.5 trillion, for instance, in commercial real estate related debt that has to be refinanced between now and the end of 2025, the so-called debt maturity wall. So I think it gets tougher. The global economy is weakening, which reinforces our weakness. Our economy is weakening. Borrowing costs are higher, that's incontrovertible, and excess inflation persists, which means the Federal Reserve likely has to maintain higher rates for longer. Some segments tend to hold better than others, including public construction. Obviously, lots of money lined up for infrastructure, grocery stores, you got to eat, and multifamily housing, at least from the perspective of apartment leasing, if not construction activity. At some point, the Federal Reserve will stop raising rates. That will represent a key inflection point for the economy, and more importantly, we'll start cutting them. But I don't think that begins until next year. And so we're stuck with these high interest rates right now and tightening credit conditions. I think recession conditions will prevail at some point in the next 12 months, but of course I could be wrong. I'm an economist. Hey, thanks a lot for the opportunity to be with you today. I think I've left some time for Q&A, so let me stop sharing my screen and let's turn it over for questions and answers. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you today.
So from the simple drywall contractors here, they're saying, is this a good time to sell their ongoing construction business?
Look, I think it probably is a good time to sell your construction business, if in fact that's what you want to do. So, you know, we're still in an economy where there's lots of people looking for investment opportunities. There are lots of private equity firms out there who'll be looking for roll-up opportunities. So they don't just buy, you know, one drywall contractor. They buy a bunch of them, right? And now they have a cluster of firms, and they have market power. They have pricing power, right? Because they're all basically one firm now, and we see a lot of that. And so I hear from a lot of owners who are in their 60s. Their kids don't want to take over the business. They've built a good business. They have, you know, reliable sources of revenue. They're profitable. And they're wondering, should I sell my business? And I think now is not a terrible time. I think, though, that there will be a better time after the recession is over. So if one can wait until years like 2025 or 2026, I think it gets better for them. Why is that? Because at that point, a few things are happening. First, I think we're out of recession by then. I think interest rates are lower by then, which means that buyers have more capacity to borrow money to buy businesses. And also, I think you're going to see another housing boom. And why is that? Because there is this unmet demand for housing in America, and interest rates took off before that demand was satisfied. So you got a lot of millennial and Gen Z households forming that want to own a home, but right now it's not a good time for them to buy a home. At some point, as mortgage rates go down in out years, it becomes a good time to buy a home, and then you get lots of demand for drywall contractors and similarly situated professional firms, painters, so on and so forth. And I think that's actually a better time. But now is not a terrible time.
Okay, someone's taking offers if anyone's interested. The labor market decreased due to the baby boomer generation retiring and the Gen Z coming up. So what does that add to the economy in terms of recession, or positive, negative, otherwise?
Yeah, right. So, you know, the thing is, baby boomers, it's a very large generation. They are, you know, the oldest of that group is now well into their 70s. You know, the youngest of that group, if you define that generation as being born between, let's say, 1945 to 1964, or 1946 to 1964, that group, you know, now is approaching, the youngest are approaching their 60s, right? Retirement age is right around the corner. So that generation is disappearing from the labor force, replaced by a much smaller generation known as Gen Z. Gen Z typically is defined as being born from 1997 to 2012. So the oldest generation this year will turn 26. The youngest of this generation is still very much in school. And so they're not, and because immigration policies changed, we just are not growing this labor force fast enough. And plus we have very low fertility rates now in this country, mimicking certain Asian countries and European countries at this point. So given all of that, it's not simply a cyclical issue, this workforce shortage. It's a structural issue, a structural shortfall. Why is that recessionary? Because while that engenders lower unemployment because people are competing for this scarcity, this scarce number of workers, it's also inflationary. And it's really the Federal Reserve's response to that inflation that's the issue here. It's at a higher cost of capital. And again, you've got lots of interest rate increases behind us that have yet to work their way fully through the economy, and perhaps some more to come. For instance, the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, Jim Bullard, who's very influential, said that he sees another 2 rate increases this year. So rates are already high. They might be headed higher, even as banks are already wrestling with these higher interest rates. So anyway, that's the problem.
Okay, so that's all the questions we have for today. So on behalf of AWCI, thank you, Dr. Basu, for your presentation, and thank you to our attendees. Please join us next week, June 15th at 1 for our panel discussion on drywall cart safety part 2. You can find more information and register at awci.org. Thank you, Dr. Basu. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks. Have a great day, everyone. Have a great week, year, life. Thanks.